Morning, class. Today we are beginning our chapter on the philosophical concept of freedom. And so in this video, I thought it would be helpful to go over four concepts and then discuss how they relate to each other. The first concept is libertarian free will. The second concept is determinism. The third concept is compatibilism. And the fourth concept is fatalism. So we'll begin by talking about libertarian free will. Libertarian free will is defined as the ability to do otherwise when making choices. It has nothing to do with anything political referring to libertarianism. So this is a philosophical position, which is different from the political position of libertarianism. So what this means is that we as individuals, when we make choices, we literally have the ability to do otherwise. They can be trivial choices or monumental choices. What we decide to eat, the way we decide to take to go to work or school, uh, we have a variety of choices available to us, and we do have the ability to select to do otherwise. How do we do this philosophically? This is a problem. Explaining how we do this philosophically will be part of this chapter, trying to figure out how we do this. But there are options available to us. This could suggest that the universe does not work in deterministic ways, but this by itself does not provide us all we need to know to know how we do in fact make decisions and in the environment of being able to do otherwise. So first we would have to somehow show that the universe does not necessarily work in completely deterministic ways. And once we did that, we'd have to show how that and perhaps other things would allow us to have freedom. So libertarian free will is defined as the ability to do otherwise when making choices. Should I go right or should I go left when walking? Um, you decide one or the other, but the choice of both were available to you. The universe did not necessarily work in a deterministic way where you would have only chosen one, even though it seemed like you had the possibility to go one way or the other. That possibility was just illusory. Libertarian free will would say, no, no, it's not illusory. You literally have the ability to do otherwise. So this is how freedom is defined, and there's a variety of theorists who will argue for a libertarian free will, and with that, the ability to do otherwise. The second philosophical position is determinism, and this agrees with the libertarian free will in the concept of freedom. Right. Determinism also believes that if we had freedom, it would be the ability to do otherwise. We just don't have the ability to do otherwise. Phenomenologically or introspectively, it appears as though we have the ability to do otherwise, but that's simply illusory. Determinism is the thesis that all events are predetermined by prior events and are therefore inevitable and inescapable. From the beginning of time, a series of events were set in motion. Each event had a prior cause up to this very moment, which is simply the result of prior causes. And so all events are determined by prior events, and therefore there is no room for freedom, freedom being defined as the ability to do otherwise. This can apply to a um, materialistic view of the cosmos. It has also in philosophical and theological language. It can also, or concepts rather, it can also apply to models of the cosmos in which there's a all-knowing God who knows everything and therefore would know what you're going to do. And if God knew what you're going to do, then would you be free to do otherwise? This again, so this problem can be applied to particular theological frameworks, but it can also be applied to a scientific, materialistic, or naturalistic view of the universe as well. The third concept is compatibilism, and this assumes the ontology of a deterministic universe. So in the compatibilist view, um, the the compatibilists will say that all events are predetermined and therefore inevitable. But what the compatibilist will also argue is that freedom is not the ability to do otherwise, but rather the ability to do what one wants. And one's will can also line up with the deterministic outcomes of the universe. The analogy or illustration of the compatibilist viewpoint is essentially one of the more prevalent examples given is a person who's locked in a room, but who does not desire to leave the room, and so never uh, finds out that the room is locked. And so is that person determined to stay in that room? Well, yes, the person's determined to stay in the room because the room is locked. Is that person staying in the room of their own free will? Well, it can be argued that they are as well, because they desire to be in that room, right? They don't desire to leave. If they did desire to leave, they wouldn't be free, but it just so happens that their will is compatible with the nature of the uh, of the particular circumstances they find themselves in, have been necessitated. They could not do otherwise, but they are free to be in the room because they desire to be in the room. So, in this perspective, an individual is free if they can do what they want to do, um, even though they could not do otherwise. So these are some of the distinctions between libertarian free will, determinism, and compatibilism. The fourth and final concept is fatalism, and fatalism is compared to determinism, but it's slightly different. Fatalism is aspects of it are described in much literature. We could look at the story of Oedipus as his fate or destiny is prophesied, and then even though he tries to avoid it, it ends up happening. I like the example given in the second chapter of von Inwagen's An Essay on Free Will, which discusses fatalism. So he gives two examples. I'll summarize both. In the first example, individual goes to see a witch, and this witch prophesies that the individual will die from drowning. Now, as soon as the individual leaves the place where the witch is and the prophet who prophesied, uh, some of his enemies catch him and hold him underwater in a well or fountain, and he dies of drowning. And so this would be his fate. This is one example of fatalism, but it's not necessarily the example that many focus on when discussing fatalism. The second example or scenario is the guy goes to see the witch, and the witch prophesies that he will die of drowning that day. That's also one of the details in the story. It is prophesied that during that day he will die of drowning. So he says, I'm going to try to avoid it, and he decides to hike up to a mountain because that's the furthest away from any water source. And as he's hiking up the mountain, he falls, and he falls into an underground well, and there he dies of drowning. Now, the important detail in the second story is had he just gone home and ignored the prophecy, he wouldn't have died of drowning. And so there's the difference there. The second one seems in a strange way more inescapable than the first. It's not that in fatalism, it's not that the universe is determined such that only events are caused by prior causes, and therefore you can't deviate, you can't do otherwise. That would be determinism. In fatalism, it's somewhat different. No matter what you do, a certain outcome will happen. Um, and so you can't escape your fate. And sometimes the stories describing this idea of fatalism is that even when one tries to escape their fate, they end up causing that very fate, that had they just ignored it, they wouldn't have experienced it. And so these are four concepts relating to the philosophical topic of freedom. Things that relate to freedom, and the way it relates to other philosophical topics, which are interesting to keep in mind. Responsibility and the self. Both of these topics really quickly relate to, or almost immediately relate to, the concept of freedom. If we argue that the human being is free, then what is the human being, um, in order that the human being is free? If we argue that the universe is deterministic, or what we might say the naturalistic understanding of the universe is deterministic, then it would seem that human beings are no exception. Just like we can predict the motions of the planets, which are natural objects, so could we predict all the behaviors of the human beings if we had a sophisticated way of measuring all the data and calculating it and sort of projecting it into a future model. And a lot of science fiction films sort of toy with this idea. Um, but in theory, in this deterministic theory, it would be possible to do that very thing. So if human beings are free, we would have to sort of be something perhaps more than the naturalistic um, universe. And so certain theories say, well, maybe there's the mind that's separate, or the soul, or something like that. But those would be making philosophical assertions about the very nature of the self, and in consequence, the very nature of the universe. So this is how the topic relates to those questions. You could argue that the very nature of the universe is indeterministic, right? But then that's different from saying that we're free. We'd have to go from, okay, suppose that the universe behaves with indeterminacy at whatever level. How does that then make us free, as opposed to just being victims of chance, as opposed to victims of determinism? We could also think about moral philosophy and ethics and responsibility. If we are not doing acts out of our own free will, then how should we be held responsible? And there's different types of ways of holding people responsible. We could punish people just to because they do things we consider to be bad or crimes. But did they do them out of their own free will? We could still perhaps justify punishing them for a greater good, because the punishment would effectively serve to deter them from committing more crimes in a deterministic model. But would it be morally right to punish people for doing committing crimes or acts that they couldn't do otherwise, right? They had no free will in the matter. So these are all interesting philosophical questions, uh, both involving the problem of freedom and relating to the problem of freedom. It connects to metaphysics and epistemology, particularly the nature of the universe and the nature of the self. It connects to moral responsibility very quickly. So these are some things to consider when thinking about the philosophical topic of freedom. Hopefully this was helpful. Thank you.